For 15 years, the piece of land Elias Thorne called his own had offered little comfort. It was a stubborn patch of earth on the far edge of Redemption Bluff, a place where the sun baked the ground hard in the summer, and the wind cut sharp in the winter. What stood on it was a testament to sheer will over reason. There was the house. Small and leaning, its walls a patchwork of timbers weathered to the color of bone. A tired-looking barn, whose roof sagged in the middle like a tired old back. A handful of hens that scratched at the packed dirt for a living. And a mule, gray and scarred, who was now good for little more than watching the horizon. Elias fit the land. The folks in town, when they spoke of him at all, called him the soldier. Which war he'd fought in was a question that had long since faded. He didn't carry the past like a medal, or a wound. It was simply a fact, like the rising of the sun. Something that had happened, and was now done. After his service, he'd laid track for the railroad, then loaded freight, until the work ran out, or he did. Now, he simply existed. He mended what was broken, and fed what was hungry. His life was measured by simple rituals. Up before the light. Coffee simmering on the stove, its bitter aroma the first real thing of the day. Tending to the mule. Scattering grain for the chickens. Checking the fence line for what the night's wind might have loosened. He had no wife. No children. He hadn't had a visitor in years. He didn't mistake the quiet for peace, but he'd made a truce with it. It was a life he had learned to endure, and in that endurance, he found a kind of order. The afternoon arrived like any other. The oppressive heat of midday was finally giving way to a steady breeze from the west. He was by the woodpile near the porch, splitting firewood. The worn handle of the hatchet was a familiar weight in his hands. A dull ache throbbed in his shoulder, a souvenir from a past he never spoke of. He didn't see her at first. It was the change in the air that he noticed. A silence that wasn't empty, but watchful. He slowly lifted his head. There, at the edge of his property line, where the tall grass met the dirt, stood a child. A wisp of a thing, no older than 7. Her dress was the color of dust and hung on her small frame like a borrowed rag. Her feet were bare. Her hair, a tangled mess. But it was her eyes that held him. They were too large for her face, and they watched him with a stillness that was ancient and unnerving. Elias let the hatchet hang loose in his hand. He didn't move forward. She didn't move back. They stood separated by 50 yards of empty space and a silence that felt heavier than sound. It wasn't fear he felt. It was a kind of dislocation, as if a gear in the world had slipped a tooth. He finally asked, his voice rough from disuse. "You lost?" No reply. She just kept watching him. He didn't know the first thing about children. His life had no room for them. But he knew what it looked like when the fight had gone out of someone. And seeing it in a child bothered him in a place he thought had long gone numb. He turned without another word. Walked up the 2 steps to his porch and went inside, leaving the door ajar. On the counter was half a loaf of bread and a piece of salted pork. He cut a thick slice of each, wrapped them in a clean rag, and walked back out. He placed the small bundle on the porch railing. Then he sat on the top step, his back to the door, and waited. Minutes passed. Then he heard the faint scrape of small feet on hard earth. She didn't snatch the food. She approached it like a wild thing, cautious, ready to bolt. When she finally took it, her small hands trembled. She ate with a desperate, silent focus. When she was done, she simply stood there. Elias went back inside and returned with a thick wool blanket. He held it out. She hesitated, then stepped forward and took it from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, and they were as cold as stone. He nodded toward a corner of the porch, sheltered from the wind. She understood. She curled up there, pulling the blanket tight around her shoulders, her eyes still open, still watching. He didn't ask her name, or where she came from. The questions felt too heavy for the quiet air. He went inside, bolted the door, and sat in his chair through the long, dark hours. He did not sleep. By dawn, when he unbolted the door and stepped outside, she was gone. The only sign she had ever been there was the wool blanket, folded neatly on the step where he had last seen her. He stood there for a long time, the folded blanket a small, square question on his porch. The silence that returned to the homestead felt different. It was an empty, expectant silence now. More than once in the next 2 days, he found himself glancing toward the fence line, listening for a sound that wasn't there. On the third evening, as the light began to fail, they came. 2 figures, walking slowly out of the dusk. The girl, and beside her, a woman. She moved with a weary grace, one hand on the child's shoulder. Her clothes were thin, her face a map of hard miles, but her eyes were sharp. They held the same exhaustion as the rest of her, but beneath it, a stubborn, unbroken light. She stopped at the fence line, the girl clinging to her side. "We aren't looking for charity," the woman said, her voice clear, though not loud. Just a place to stop running." Elias looked at her. He saw the faint, yellowing bruise just below her collarbone. He saw the way her hand trembled slightly. He saw the way the child looked at her, with a trust that was absolute. He looked from the woman's desperate eyes to the child's steady gaze. He gave no answer. Instead, he turned, walked to his cabin, and pulled the door wide open, leaving it a dark, silent invitation against the fading light. The woman, May, stepped inside first. The girl, Lahi, followed, her hand clutching a fistful of her mother's skirt. The air inside was warm, thick with the smell of wood smoke and coffee. May's eyes swept over the single room. The sparse furniture. The worn-out armchair by the stove. The narrow bed in the corner. It was a place stripped down to what was necessary, and nothing more. Elias moved to the stove and ladled a thick, dark stew into 3 bowls. He set them on the small table without a word. He didn't ask if they were hungry. He knew. They ate in silence. May sat stiffly, her gaze drifting toward the door every few moments. Lahi ate in small, quick bites, as if afraid the food might vanish. After, as Elias cleared the bowls, May stood and began to help, a reflex she couldn't suppress. He didn't stop her. She washed the bowls in the basin, her hands turning red in the cold water. The simple, domestic sound was alien in this house. There was only one bed. Elias unrolled 2 thick quilts and spread them on the floor near the hearth, creating a second makeshift bed. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and it was warm. As the fire burned down to glowing embers, May spoke, her voice low. "You have a wife?" Elias, sitting in his chair, shook his head once. "Children?" "No." She didn't ask more. She just nodded, as if that explained something. She pulled Lahi close, and they sat watching the flames, the child's head eventually slumping against her mother's shoulder. He didn't ask them where they'd come from, but he could piece it together. The fear in May's eyes. The way she moved as if her ribs ached. The way the child never strayed more than an arm's length from her mother. Later, May whispered the name of a town. Baker's Ridge. And then, the man there, he wasn't one for us to be near. That was all she offered. It was enough. The days that followed found their own quiet rhythm. It wasn't spoken of, but an arrangement was made. May rose with him at dawn. She hauled water from the well, swept the floorboards, and cooked their meals with a quiet efficiency. She mended his torn shirts, her needle moving in small, precise stitches. She asked for nothing, but her presence began to fill the empty spaces of the house. Lahi remained a small shadow. She'd watch Elias from a distance as he worked. One afternoon, as he was mending a leather strap, she crept closer. On a low shelf sat a small bird, carved from a single piece of pale wood, its surface worn smooth by time and idle hands. A thing his own father had carved, decades ago. He picked it up and held it out to her. She took it, her fingers tracing the curve of its wings. And then, a small, fragile thing happened. A smile. It was faint, and it vanished as quickly as it came, but it was there. It was the first he had ever seen on her face. Something in his chest, a place he thought long dormant, shifted. A week passed. The sagging door of the small barn needed fixing. As he gathered his tools, May was there. "I can hold the plank steady," she said. It wasn't a question. He just nodded and handed her the nails. They worked side by side that afternoon. The only sounds were the wind, the cry of a distant hawk, and the steady, rhythmic tapping of their hammers. A kind of conversation without words. That evening, Elias sat on the porch steps, watching the stars begin to prick the deep purple sky. May came out and stood near the railing. "We don't mean to be a burden," she said to the darkness. He took a long moment to answer. "Are you fixing to leave?" He could feel her gaze on him. "I've got no other road to take, Mr. Thorne." He nodded slowly, his eyes still on the horizon. "Then don't." A month bled into the next. The unspoken arrangement settled into the grain of their lives. No one spoke of how long they would stay. The question itself seemed to have no place there. The days found their own steady pulse. Measured by the sun, the chores, and the quiet meals shared at the small table. May had claimed the inside of the house as her domain. She scrubbed the floors, aired out the quilts, and filled the air with the scent of baking bread. Elias never commented, but he noticed. He noticed how she never let Lahi carry anything too heavy. He noticed how she kept her own arms covered, even as the days grew warmer. Lahi had changed the most. The small, silent shadow was gone. In her place was a girl who ran barefoot in the yard, chasing chickens with a laugh that was high and clear. She learned the mule's favorite spot to be scratched behind the ears. One morning, she followed Elias to the barn. "Does he have a name?" she asked, pointing at the old mule. Elias shook his head. "Never gave him one." "Can I?" He just nodded. She thought for a long moment. "His name is Oscar." And from that day on, Oscar it was. That Sunday, Elias hitched Oscar to the small cart. He needed flour and lamp oil from town. May stood on the porch, her arms crossed, watching him. She had not set foot off the property since the day she arrived. She didn't ask to go now. Before he climbed up, Elias hesitated. Need anything? She looked toward the open door of the cabin, where Lahi was humming. We're fine, she said softly. Then she met his eyes. You don't have to say who we are. He understood. I won't. The town of Redemption Bluff was quiet. A few men on the boardwalk nodded as he passed. Elias was not a man who invited small talk, and they did not offer it. At the general store, he gathered his supplies. Coffee. Flour. Beans. As the shopkeeper tallied the items, Elias glanced out the dusty front window. A man was leaning against a support post across the street. He wasn't a local. He was dressed too clean, but his boots were scuffed with hard travel. He wasn't doing anything. Just watching the street. Watching the store. A cold knot tightened in Elias's gut. He paid for his things, loaded them onto the cart, and started the long ride home. The image of the man burned into his mind. He returned as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the yard. The cabin was quiet. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, May was at the wash basin, and Lahi was drawing on a piece of scrap paper with a charcoal nub. Elias set the heavy sack on the table. There was a man in town, he said, his voice low and flat. May stilled, her hands submerged in the water. Leaning outside the general store. Watching. She turned to him slowly, her face pale in the lamplight. She wiped her hands on her apron. Was he tall? Wearing a brown vest? Elias nodded once. A breath escaped her lips, a sound of pure weariness. That's his brother. The fragile peace they had built shattered in the silence that followed. That night, after the girl was asleep, Elias didn't sit in his chair. He stood on the porch in the cool, dark air. His rifle rested in the crook of his arm. He was no longer just a man guarding his solitude. He was a man guarding a home. The next few days passed in a heavy, watchful silence. The routines of the house continued, but the spirit behind them had changed. May kept the curtains drawn. The low humming she once did while cooking was gone. Her shoulders were drawn tight, her movements precise and quiet. Lahi sensed the shift. She stayed indoors, her world shrinking to the four walls of the cabin. She asked fewer questions. Elias saw the light in her eyes dim a little, and he hated it. His own routines became sharper, more focused. Each evening, he would sit by the lamplight and clean his rifle. Not because it was dirty, but because the ritual calmed him. The familiar scent of oil and steel, the solid weight of the weapon in his hands. He took to walking the property line before dusk, his gaze scanning the trees, the brush, the long shadows. He was a soldier again, reading the terrain for threats. On the third morning, he opened an old footlocker beneath his bed. From it, he pulled a small, heavy revolver wrapped in an oilcloth. He found May by the stove. He didn't say a word, just held it out to her. She looked at the gun, then at his face. She took it without hesitation. Her hands were steady as she checked the cylinder, then she wrapped it in a clean rag and tucked it deep into the pocket of her apron. Nothing needed to be said. Later that day, Lahi followed him to the barn. She stood close as he filled a feed bucket. You ever have a girl of your own? She asked, her voice small. Elias stopped what he was doing. No, he said after a moment. Had a brother, once. She tilted her head. You're nice. You should have had one. He didn't know what to say to that. He just finished his work. That night, the wind howled outside, rattling the window panes. The three of them sat near the warmth of the stove. Did he ever? Elias started, his voice low. Hit you in front of her? May stared into the fire. He didn't care who saw, she said, her voice flat. A long silence passed. Then she asked, there was someone else here before us, wasn't there? In this house? My brother, Elias said. His name was Daniel. The war took him. I had a sister, May said quietly. Fever took her when we were young. After that, it was just me. They sat there for a while, two solitary people sharing the ghosts of their past in the flickering light. Elias did not go to bed that night. He sat in the armchair facing the door, the rifle across his lap, his boots still on. May did not go to sleep either. She sat on the floor, wrapped in a quilt, her back against the wall, watching the fire die down. Around 3 a.m, he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not the wind. Not the mules shifting in the barn. It was the distinct, deliberate crunch of a boot on dry leaves. He rose without a sound, a shadow detaching from the darkness. He peered through a crack in the curtain. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line. A silhouette against the faint starlight. Watching the cabin. After a long minute, the shape turned and melted back into the woods. Elias let the curtain fall. He sat back down. The next morning, he went out and found the tracks. When he came back inside, May was waiting. She knew from the look on his face. You saw him, she said. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded. He was watching. She poured him a cup of coffee, her hands perfectly steady. Then we'll be ready. And they were. The frost clung to the window panes like a thin, silver web. Dawn broke, not with color, but with a slow, gray light that made the world look cold and tired. Elias sat in his chair, where he had been all night. May was near the stove, a still figure wrapped in a quilt. Then came the sound. A deliberate crunch of a boot on the frozen ground outside. Then another. He was coming. Elias rose without a sound and moved to the window. A tall figure, wearing a dark coat and hat, was walking from the tree line toward the barn. He moved with an easy confidence, like he owned the ground he walked on. Elias turned to May. He's here. She was already on her feet. Her face was calm, her eyes clear. She moved to the cot where Lahi slept, her hand going to the pocket of her apron, to the cold, hard weight within. I'll keep her here, she whispered. Behind the stove. Elias nodded. He took his rifle, worked the lever in one smooth, quiet motion, and stepped outside before the man reached the porch. The cold air hit him like a fist. His boots scraped the frost from the wooden steps. The man heard the door open and turned, his walk slowing. They met in the open space between the cabin and the barn, where there was no cover. You Elias Thorne? The man asked. His voice was steady, with a practiced edge of authority. Elias just looked at him. I'm here for a woman named May. And a little girl. Seen 'em? The air was still. Elias could see the man's breath mist in front of his face. He could see the cold certainty in the man's eyes. This was not a brother looking for family. This was a hunter. You the one she ran from? Elias asked, his voice a low rumble. A smirk touched the man's lips. That what she told you? I'm just here to collect what's mine. She ain't yours. The words hung in the frozen air between them. The smirk on the man's face vanished. You think you're some kind of hero, old man? Hiding out here in the middle of nowhere? Elias raised the rifle just slightly, so the barrel was level with the man's chest. I ain't playing at anything. The man's hand drifted down, hovering near the pistol at his belt. His eyes narrowed, testing, searching for a flicker of fear in Elias's face. He found none. I've buried better men than you, Elias said, his voice as cold and hard as the ground beneath their feet. And I won't lose a night's sleep doing it again. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The man stared into Elias's eyes, and for the first time, his confidence wavered. He saw no anger there. No fear. Just the dead, flat certainty of a man who had nothing left to prove, and nothing left to lose. He took a step back. Then another. He spat on the ground. She'll just run from you, too. It's what her kind does. Elias didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched. The man turned without another word, walked back to the trees where his horse was tied, and swung himself into the saddle. He rode away without looking back, his figure shrinking until he was swallowed by the gray morning woods. Elias stood there until long after the sound of the hoofbeats had faded. Only then did he lower the rifle. He turned and walked back to the cabin. Inside, May was kneeling by the cot, her arms wrapped around a now awake Lahi, who was clutching her mother's dress. Is he gone? May whispered. Elias nodded. A long, shuddering breath escaped May's lips, a breath she had been holding for years. Lahi looked from her mother to Elias, her eyes wide. You didn't shoot him, she said. Elias knelt down, meeting her gaze. Didn't need to. That day, something broke free in the small cabin. A tension that had held the very air captive for days finally dissolved. May walked to the window and pulled back the curtains, letting the pale morning light flood the room. She unpinned her hair, letting it fall freely over her shoulders. Lahi, seeming to sense the change, went outside and chased the chickens, her laughter echoing in the crisp air. It was a sound of pure, uncomplicated joy. The house could breathe again. In the weeks that followed, spring arrived in earnest. The frozen ground softened, and small, green shoots began to push their way through the hard dirt. The world was waking up, and so were they. One morning, they all rode into town together. Elias drove the cart, Oscar the mule pulling steady. May sat beside him, and Lahi rode in the back, her small feet dangling over the edge. It was the first time May had left the property since that first day. She held her head high. People in Redemption Bluff watched them pass, a few folks nodding at Elias. They saw the woman and the child, but no one asked questions. They stopped at the one-room schoolhouse. A woman with kind eyes came out and knelt down to speak to Lahi. That afternoon, they returned home with flour, soap, a new pair of shoes for the girl, and the promise that she could start her lessons on Monday. They were building a future. That evening, they sat on the porch together, all three of them. The old boards creaked under their shared weight. The sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in soft strokes of pink and gold. Lahi dozed, her head resting in her mother's lap. May looked out at the land, at the long shadows stretching from the barn. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked quietly. "How this all turned out?" Elias watched the last sliver of sun disappear. "Didn't expect it," he said. "Me neither." A small smile touched her lips. "Are you glad you let us stay?" He thought for a moment. "I am." She looked at him, her gaze steady in the fading light. "I didn't just stay, Elias," she said. "I stopped running." Later, after the stars had come out, Elias carried a sleeping Lahi inside and tucked her into the narrow bed. As he pulled the quilt over her, she stirred, her eyes half open. "You're not going anywhere, are you?" she mumbled. He gently squeezed her small hand. "I'm right here." When he turned, May was standing in the doorway, watching him. The lamplight cast a warm glow around her. "She believes in you," she said softly. He nodded. "She should." May stepped closer, until she was standing right in front of him. "So do I." And then, she laid her head gently against his chest. He stood still for a moment, surprised by the simple, trusting weight of her. Then, his arms came up and wrapped around her, holding her close. He could feel the steady, quiet beat of his own heart. It was a feeling he hadn't known he was missing until right now. Outside, the prairie was vast and silent. But inside the small, leaning cabin, under the quiet watch of the stars, they were no longer three solitary souls. They were home.